Hi, my name is Kenny, and today I will be presenting the result of my survey study about improving the virtual learning experiences of classes. And so first is an overview for the goals and context of my survey study. And so as the United States continues to struggle with the COVID-19 pandemic, one thing that has been particularly clear is that schools and universities are still adapting to an online learning environment. Previously, I've conducted both a field and interview study to investigate the question of how can teachers better support students in a live and synchronous virtual classroom environment. The field study found that students tend to participate more in classes when there are multiple methods of engagement, opportunities for small group interactions, and when the classroom has a relaxed and lively atmosphere. These were great as high-level recommendations, but ultimately it posed a number of limitations as I was only able to observe the interactions between students and instructors, but did not have any knowledge into the individualized perspectives and experiences as people attending classes. As a result, an interview study was then conducted to do just that. The interview study found that there was a high amount of fatigue in virtual learning environments, a lack of routine causes students to not be mentally present during class, and students engaged more in small group settings. While these addressed the limitations of the field study, more limitations were introduced in the fact that I was only able to interview 5 students total, and that the results may not be applicable to a larger audience. Thus, the purpose of the survey study was to validate the results of both the field and interview study. And so, the survey study was framed around the design question of how can teachers create a more supportive experience and environment for students in virtual classes. And one important thing to note up front about the survey study was that there were only 56 participants. And although this was a much larger size than the 6 participants in the interview study and the 6 classes in the field study, this is still a very small number in terms of sample size. And so, moving on to the methodology of the survey study, in order to reflect the typical experience of a student in a virtual learning environment, the survey was conducted on participants who were fluent English speakers between the ages of 15 and 65, is a student in an accredited program or school, and recently or is currently attending virtual classes. This criteria was chosen to ensure that the data collected are reflective of people who are taking classes and going to school in a virtual learning environment. No specific criteria was mentioned about gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, or others because the study is aimed at all students in general rather than a specific subset. And so this survey was created with Sogo Survey, an online survey tool, and then distributed through personal outreach as well as posting on my own social media platforms. Personal outreach was chosen primarily because as a way of ensuring participants fit the ideal criteria, people are more likely to participate in the survey study, if asked directly rather than just like a general posting. However, general posting was also used since I don't particularly have the capacity to directly contact a large number of people to participate in the survey study. And so moving on to the research questions for the survey study. After taking a look at the results and recommendations from both my field and interview study, 8 high-level questions were generated to hopefully be answered by the survey study. The questions were created about either elaborating, confirming, exploring, or extending those results from the field and interview study. And below are 2 of the high-level research questions used to create my survey study. These questions were included because they tie directly into the results and recommendations shown in this presentation. One thing to note is that all my research questions were answered by my survey study, but were not included as they mostly confirmed previous findings. These findings, however, gave new insights that were not seen before in my field nor interview study. And so onto the findings themselves. And so the first finding is the survey study showed that there's in fact a correlation between the location a person attends virtual class from and how often they get distracted in a 1-hour class period. In the graph, each of the colors represent different locations, with yellow being a table, green being desk, and red being a bed. And I selected these 3 locations to show because they came up in my interview study. One thing to note is that participants made a distinction between a table and a desk, and as a result, I kept them as 2 separate locations rather than combining them into one location. The graph then showed that shows that between a table and a desk, the most frequent bucket for distraction frequency is 3 to 5 times a class, while for a bed as a location, the most frequent bucket is 6 to 8 times a class. This shows that location does matter in how engaged a student is and how frequently they get distracted. Bringing this to a higher level, people tend to associate being in bed with sleeping or relaxing compared to sitting at a table or desk as a more of a working mindset. And as a result, we can see here that people who attend class from a table or desk are better able to focus during classes. And so to address this finding, instructors should encourage and remind students that even though the state of the world is unlike anything before, it doesn't mean that students should throw out all of the conventions of a regular classroom, like sitting at a desk. The environment that students attend class from is one of the most important things to a student's learning ability. Just like how students would not regularly lay down in a traditional classroom setting to learn, they should not be laying down in bed either for virtual classes. And instructors should also strongly encourage students to turn on their cameras to have a sense of accountability that students are actually in an environment that is conducive to their learning. I shy away from saying that instructors should require students to turn the cameras on because with attending virtual classes from a home environment, it introduces a number of privacy issues where instructors cannot compel students to turn on the cameras. Instead, instructors should strongly remind and strongly encourage students to turn on the cameras. And so the second finding of my survey study is that students are generally split between having synchronous or asynchronous style classes when attending class online. This was a very interesting finding from the survey study, as my interview study showed that students generally preferred having an asynchronous class due to the lack of routine messing with their sleeping schedule. However, as we can see from this graph, students are pretty much evenly split between preferring asynchronous, synchronous, or both styles of classes, which shows that students in general have different styles of learning. This isn't particularly new, as educators in general have figured out in a traditional classroom environment, students learn differently from each other. What may work for some may not work for others. However, one thing that seemed to be lost in this transition to an online environment is requiring students to all learn in one style, whether that's synchronous or asynchronous. And as a result, no matter what the format of the class is, we can see that about a third of the class will be forced to learn in an environment that does not suit their preferred learning style. And so, amending my recommendations for my interview study, I am now suggesting that instructors structure the class in a way so that there's both an asynchronous and a synchronous option for class. This way, students are given the flexibility to choose whichever learning style works best for them, whether that is being physically present with other students as an instructor teaches live, or it's student learning on their own through a video recording. This can look like instructors hosting a class at a set time every day, where students can join and participate like they normally would, and then afterwards, instructors publishing a video recording of the material afterwards. The one thing I would caution against is recording the live classroom itself and then publishing that as the asynchronous option, because sometimes there are activities that are done in the class that would not have the same effects as watching it online. For example, going to smaller groups to do an activity. And the one thing to note is that this will more than likely increase the workload on instructors because they are now being asked to provide a second version of the class. However, while it is more work, this will provide students the flexibility to learn in whichever format fits them the best. And so, the third finding of my survey study showed that participants rating how important collaboration is and participants rating the engagement level in class do not affect how often students communicate with one another in a virtual classroom. In the graphs, the rating for collaboration importance and engagement level is split by colors shown in the key. These are then grouped together by buckets for communication frequency and plotted against how many students selected that bucket. As we see from both graphs, there's a normal distribution of data between rated collaboration importance and rated engagement level and communication frequency. This then shows that there is no correlation between the two of them. What this finding implies that no matter what students think about how important collaboration is, nor how engaged they are actually in class, students may not communicate that often with others. From the graphs, the mode frequency of communication is 1 to 2 times a class, followed by 3 to 6 times a class. And this can probably be attributed to years of traditional learning style where students are required to be quiet during class when instructors are teaching, as well as a hesitancy to ask or answer questions in class for fear of being judged by others. And so as a result, my recommendation for instructors is to de-emphasize students talking to one another as a measurement of how engaged students are. Oftentimes, instructors will propose questions to class and no one will answer. I saw this frequently during my field study observations, and what followed was a look of frustration or disappointment in instructors as no one answered the question. Instead, instructors should use other metrics as a measurement for how engaged students are in class by doing like small polls or quizzes at the end of the class to see if students retain the material taught in class. Adding on to this, it was also encouraged that instructors ask students for their preference on how they would like to work with others. In my interview study, I recommend that smaller group settings be utilized more often as a way of allowing students to engage with one another. However, the results from this survey study show that even then, students may communicate with their classmates very little or none at all. By asking students what their preferences are, instructors can better create environments where those who want to work in smaller group settings and benefit from talking to others can work together, while others who don't want to do that can do the activities by themselves. This ensures flexibility and accommodates multiple students' learning preferences. And so moving on to the next steps after the study. And so at the conclusion of the study, my next steps, if I had the opportunity to do, would actually be implement the recommendations from this survey study, as well as the recommendations from the field and interview study. All three of these studies build off one another and gave me a look at the virtual learning environment from multiple perspectives and depths. After going through each study and building a solid recommendations that are supported by one another, it is now time to see if the implementation of these recommendations will have a positive effect on the virtual learning environment. And afterwards, I would then conduct a field study to observe at a high level how these changes affect the virtual learning environment. And a field study is chosen here because after implementing these changes, it's important to see what effects those changes have in the context of a virtual learning environment itself. And so, after conducting the study, here are some points of reflection. And so, if I had the opportunity to conduct the study again, I would conduct the study on a more random and bigger sample size. Like I said at the beginning, while having a participant size of n equals 56 is fairly large in comparison to my field and interview study, it is still a small number in the grand scheme of things. Ideally, I would want to conduct the study on a sample size upwards of 100 in order to be able to provide a statistical significance to my results. In addition, my personal outreach to participants in the study may have introduced a bias in the results. And to reduce that, I would randomly select people from a list of friends and then reach out to those folks instead. And one limitation of this survey study was that it did not provide me the opportunity to follow up on some responses that I saw. After closing the survey and looking through the responses, I want to clarify some of the things I saw, like what the difference was between a table and a desk. But since the survey was anonymous, I did not have the opportunity to do so. And the hardest part of conducting the survey study was the analysis and finding trends across the questions. Mostly it was due to the nature of the questions themselves and me being unsure if I could actually compare those numbers. Though, what surprised me the most about my survey study was the number of people who participate in it. I only reached out to about 20 people, but after posting on social media, after a few days, I had a much bigger influx of participants. After talking to some of my peers who did the same thing, they were also surprised that I was able to get roughly 30 additional people to participate in my survey. And adding on to that, like the most fun part about my survey study was reaching out to people I haven't talked to in a while, due to the various things that are happening in our lives, and asking them to take the survey. It gave me an opportunity to catch up with these folks for a bit, which was very nice to do after being in a pandemic for almost a year now. And so, thank you for listening to my presentation, and if you have any questions, please direct them to my email.